The sky above King's Landing was a pall of ash and fog on the morning Jon Snow returned to the capital. The broken city still bore the wounds of war, collapsed towers, blackened rubble, and a shaken populace not yet sure how to face the new dawn. Few dared gather in the streets when his procession arrived. The memory of Drogon's flames lingered like a curse, haunting alleyways and corners where shadows seemed longer, darker. Yet news of the peace that had been brokered, the peace ushered in after Daenerys Targaryen had fallen, spread among the people. They emerged slowly, eyes wary, to see the man on horseback, the man many called a reluctant hero. It was clear from the slump in his shoulders that he carried a burden heavier than any crown. He did not want a throne. He did not want power. But it had become his lot to decide the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. Tyrion Lannister stood near the cracked steps leading up to what remained of the Red Keep. His hair was unkempt, his clothing worn from weeks of living in half-burnt quarters, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Still, his voice maintained that curious mixture of sharp wit and guarded hope when he greeted Jon. They exchanged no formalities beyond a simple nod. Tyrion had long known that fine words mattered little when the realm lay in ruin around them. It was time for something new, something different, if only they had the vision and will to forge it. Jon dismounted and ran a gloved hand through Ghost's thick white fur. The direwolf, scarred from battles of his own, brushed against Jon's leg before trotting a few paces ahead, ears perked, as if scouting the city. The men in Jon's retinue, mostly Northmen who had followed him out of loyalty rather than ambition, gathered quietly behind him. They knew as well as anyone that the Iron Throne had been melted into a twisted lump of steel by dragonfire. The symbol of absolute monarchy, hammered into shape by centuries of conquest and fear, was gone. Jon lifted his gaze to the scorched outline of the throne room's once magnificent archway. In his mind's eye, he could almost see the iron chair that had caused so much grief, its jagged edges that had drawn the blood of those who dared to sit upon it. Daenerys had dreamed of breaking the wheel, but in the end, she had become it. Her pursuit of a just world had led to terror. The ghosts of that horror haunted the corridors. And here he was, the man who had cared for her in so many ways, forced by the necessity of saving countless innocents to become the instrument of her end. He swallowed the lump in his throat, recalling her final breath. He had never wanted the power she held. It had always felt foreign to him. Now, as he stood among the ruins, he found himself on the precipice of a choice that could shape the realm for centuries to come. Tyrion approached, boots stirring the dust on the flagstones. "Jon," he said softly, "it is good you're here. The small council, or what's left of it, has been trying to keep some semblance of order. But there's no real authority. There's no king. And this city can't bear another war of succession." Jon nodded. His voice emerged quieter than he intended. "I know. We need to figure out a way forward." The midday sun fought through the layers of soot in the air, revealing the aftermath of Daenerys' assault more starkly. Charred beams, scorched stones, the remnants of collapsed roofing. People had begun to rebuild, but the fear of a new tyrant lingered in every glance. The throne was gone, truly gone, and with it, the monarchy's fearsome seat of power was no longer physically present. Yet a vacuum remained, and the lords and ladies of Westeros were circling, each wanting to shape the future to their advantage. Some clamored to place Jon on a newly forged throne. Others whispered of Gendry Baratheon's claim through Robert's bloodline. Still others spoke of distant Targaryen kin, of the exiled prince rumored to live in Essos, or of a powerful alliance that might end all dispute. The realm seemed poised for another cycle of bloodshed unless a radical new solution took root. "We can't just keep doing what we've always done," Jon said, his voice growing steadier as Tyrion ushered him inside, away from prying ears. "It's always one king or queen after another. Each time we think they might be different, that this one might rule justly, and each time we find ourselves in ruin." Tyrion eyed him carefully, fiddling with the hem of his worn doublet. "I've been thinking the same, but if not a monarchy, what else is there? You can't simply set aside the old ways without something to replace them." He pursed his lips. "Though I've heard ideas. Sam and I have had long conversations, actually. He's quite eager to share his reading from the old annals. The free cities, for instance, or those smaller enclaves in Essos that choose their own magisters. There is something in those histories, I believe, worth exploring. John's expression was grim, but there was a small spark of determination in his gray eyes. We should speak with Sam. We should speak with Davos, and with those lords who have open minds. Perhaps there's a way to let the people choose. Not just lords, all the people. In the long hallway, ashes crunched underfoot. Tapestries that once proclaimed House Targaryen's glory were singed and hung in tattered ribbons. Jon glanced at them, recalling how Daenerys had once admired her family's heraldry. His heart felt leaden, but he pressed on, understanding that the cost of a broken realm might yet be redeemed by forging a future free from the endless cycle of monarchy. Tyrion, walking beside him, inhaled deeply, as though steadying his nerves. The idea was audacious, if not outright mad, to many. But madness, after all the realm had endured, might be exactly what was needed, so long as it was not the madness of unchecked power, but rather a new kind of hope. Word spread quickly that King's Landing's new caretaker, some already whispering the word king, though Jon rejected it, had no interest in crowning himself. Already, the city's small folk found cause for curiosity and guarded optimism. Soldiers from the north and from the Vale patrolled side by side, not in conquest but in a genuine effort to maintain order and distribute food. Grain shipments from Highgarden arrived regularly under Davos Seaworth's oversight, and for the first time in recent memory, the war-weary populace did not live in immediate fear of a dragon's wrath or a tyrant's cruelty. The scars of war would not fade easily, but a fragile peace had taken root among the rubble. Samwell Tarly arrived 2 days later, riding a borrowed gelding with Gilly and little Sam at his side in a small carriage. The moment he dismounted in the courtyard of the Red Keep, he nearly tripped over his own robes in his eagerness to greet Jon. The two embraced, and if tears glistened at the corner of Sam's eyes, he made no effort to hide them. Tyrion stood at a polite distance, a smirk curving his lips as he observed the long friendship. It was a rare sight of sincerity in a place that had known far too much deceit. Sam insisted on speaking immediately, dragging Jon and Tyrion into a dusty library alcove that had miraculously survived much of the destruction. Broken windows let in shafts of pale light, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. Piles of scorched books littered the floor, but Sam had already begun rummaging through them, piling anything of interest onto a large oak table. "I found references," he began, voice trembling with excitement, "to a system of governance in the distant past, in one of the far-off realms across the narrow sea. It was a league of free cities that chose their leaders by consensus. The details are fragmentary, but the essence is that no single family could claim total rule in perpetuity. They had councils, and the people, well, at least certain ranks of the people, had a say in who governed them." Tyrion nodded. "I've heard of such. Braavos has something akin to it, though it's not exactly free of corruption. And there's Volantis with its triarchs, though that, too, is riddled with intrigue." Sam waved a hand. "Of course, nothing is perfect. But imagine we have a realm exhausted by monarchy. We have lords who might accept something new if it prevents more war. Perhaps we can adapt these ideas. We could form an assembly or a council representing each of the 7 kingdoms. Instead of kings and queens, we have elected leaders. If we do it carefully, methodically, maybe we can avoid the pitfalls of complete chaos." Jon leaned his forearms on the table, glancing from Sam to Tyrion. "But is it even possible? The lords are used to handing power down by blood. Some might fight us just to preserve their status." Tyrion smiled thinly. "They will fight if they see themselves losing everything. But we can spin this in a way that appeals to them. Think. They've seen their castles burned, their armies decimated, all for the whims of a monarch who may favor or punish them at will. Perhaps they'd welcome a system where their lands are protected under laws, rather than subject to the ever-shifting mood of a tyrant. And for those who still cling to the old ways, well, we'll have to persuade them one by one, I suppose." Sam's eyes shone with hope. "We have to try. If we want to break this will, to truly break it, we need something new. And the people, gods, the people deserve a say. They're the ones who suffer the most from our wars. John released a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The idea of forging a democracy, or at least an assembly of representatives, was daunting. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw King's Landing in flames, heard the screams of mothers and children. How could he reject this chance to stop it from happening again? He knew he was not the perfect leader, that he was haunted by guilt and betrayal. He had killed a woman he loved, or at least believed he loved. But sometimes a broken man was needed to build something new. Sometimes the right decisions came from a heart that knew loss too intimately. They worked late into the night, Sam and Tyrion poring over half-burned histories, old legal texts, and the occasional Braavosi treatise that Tyrion had hidden away years ago. Slowly, an outline formed. They would propose a great council to the lords and ladies of Westeros, but this time not merely to choose a new monarch. Instead, they would present a plan for a system of governance that gave each region an elected representative. These representatives would convene in King's Landing, forming a legislative body. An elected protector of the realm would serve as an executive figure, but only for a set term, perhaps 5 years or 7. At the end of that term, a new election would be held. The details were sketchy, but the framework was there. A candle burned low on the table as they sketched proposals. Dull fatigue wore on all 3 men, but also a fervent excitement spurred them on. Tyrion proposed that each lord might keep local authority but would be answerable to the laws passed by the assembly. Sam argued that smaller folk, at least the heads of villages or trade guilds, should have some direct participation. Otherwise it was merely an aristocratic assembly under another name. Jon listened carefully, occasionally interjecting to keep the plan grounded. He remembered the free folk, how they chose their leaders by admiration and consensus, not by bloodline. There was something in that notion of earned leadership that resonated with him. He mentioned it, and Sam nodded eagerly, scribbling notes as if these ancient traditions of the free folk could be woven into the new system. When the candle finally sputtered out, Jon's eyes ached. He leaned back in his chair. The Red Keep was silent except for the distant drip of water seeping through some broken stone overhead. The nights still carried the faint smell of sulfur from burnt debris. Through a jagged window, the moon's glow revealed Ghost prowling the courtyard below, a silent sentinel. Jon wondered if he was truly ready for this enormous undertaking. But each time he considered walking away, he remembered his vow to protect the realm of the living. Perhaps this was the final stage of that vow, to protect it not just from the dead or from tyrants, but from the cycle of violence that had plagued it for so long. The next morning, letters were sent across the 7 kingdoms, urging lords, ladies, and any representatives with power to gather for a great council in King's Landing. The summons did not name Jon as king, nor did it proclaim any new ruler. It simply requested their presence to discuss the future of governance for the realm. The wording was careful, hammered out by Tyrion's acute political mind, with Sam's steady moral compass guiding it. Over the weeks that followed, responses trickled in. Some families were outraged or indignant. This notion of a council was suspiciously reminiscent of the one that had chosen Bran Stark in that alternate turn of events. Others were simply curious. Many were fatigued by war and approached with cautious open-mindedness. Meanwhile, Gendry Baratheon, who had been made Lord of Storm's End, wrote politely that he would attend. Sansa Stark responded that she would send envoys from the north, though she herself would not forsake her independent kingdom lightly. Yara Greyjoy announced she would attend only if her demands for the Iron Islands autonomy were heard. Dorne sent a message indicating they would consider whatever arrangement preserved their traditions. By the time the lords and envoys began arriving, King's Landing had undergone a modest restoration. Crops and goods from the Reach flowed in, and Tyrion worked tirelessly with Davos to ensure fair distribution so that no one starved in the interim. Jon oversaw the reconstruction efforts personally, hauling stone and rubble alongside common laborers. He found solace in the physical toil. People noticed. Whispers spread that this was no typical lord, no pampered king's son. Even the gold cloaks who had been reconstituted under new leadership found themselves warming to a man who seemed more concerned with their well-being than with the pomp of power. Sam, in the meantime, had taken to what remained of the great library with a near-religious devotion, scouring every corner for any text that might provide precedent, guidance, or cautionary tales. He compiled a thick sheaf of notes, gleaning lessons from the governance of the Night's Watch, an institution that had been electing its Lord Commander for centuries, albeit under very different circumstances. That, he reasoned, was proof enough that elections could work in Westeros, if handled properly. Of course, the Night's Watch was a brotherhood of outcasts, many criminals or bastards, sworn to duty until death. But the core idea of choosing leadership through a vote was there. Tyrion found it highly ironic that the Seven Kingdoms might learn from the humble men clad in black at the wall. As the day of the Great Council approached, the throne room itself remained in ruins, a deliberate choice on Jon's part. He wanted them to see the melted remains of the Iron Throne, to witness firsthand what the unbridled pursuit of power had wrought. So, the council was set to convene in a large open courtyard within the Red Keep's walls. Rows of wooden benches were erected. At the head of the courtyard stood a modest platform, upon which no throne was placed, only a long table with room enough for the principal speakers. Tyrion had a seat there, as did Sam. Davos was given a spot, and Gendry too, as Lord of Storm's End. Representatives from the Vale, the Riverlands, the Westerlands, Dorne, the Reach, the Iron Islands, and the North were also afforded places of prominence. And so, under a sky that flickered between bright sunshine and drifting ash, the gathered lords and ladies of Westeros took their seats. Some wore the rich finery of old houses, though many had simpler garments, for war had depleted their treasuries. A hush fell over the assembly as Jon Snow stepped forward, dressed in plain leathers, his stark sigil on one shoulder, the Targaryen sigil conspicuously absent. He stood behind the table, unarmed, ghost lurking at the edge of the courtyard. Tyrion, Sam, and Davos flanked him, each with expressions ranging from nervousness to grim determination. Jon cleared his throat, voice echoing in the courtyard. "Lords and ladies, friends and those who once were foes, we have come together in a time when the Iron Throne is gone, melted by dragon fire along with much of this city. We can rebuild King's Landing stone by stone, but if we do not change the way we rule, we will repeat the same mistakes. Too much blood has been spilled for the sake of a crown." Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Lord Royce of the Vale nodded in recognition of the wars they had seen. A lady of the Westerlands narrowed her eyes, not sure where this was going. Gendry Baratheon, still unsure if he should speak, folded his arms, listening intently. Jon continued, steel creeping into his voice. "We have seen one ruler after another promise peace and justice, only to descend into tyranny or war. Now we have a chance to do something different. I stand here not as your king. I do not want the throne. My birthright, true or not, means little to me. What matters is that the realm finds a way to govern itself without relying on the will of a single family or a single individual." At this, murmurs spread through the assembly. Jon held up a hand for silence. "I propose that we form a new council, a permanent assembly, where each region sends representatives. These representatives will have the power to draft laws, resolve disputes, and, most importantly, choose who will serve as protector of the realm for a set period of years. That protector will be bound by the council's decisions and by a set of laws that protect the people from tyranny." A more pronounced rustling now stirred among the lords and ladies. Some looked startled, others outraged. Lord Tarly of Horn Hill, Sam's estranged father, had died, but the Tarleys remaining in power were present, exchanged glances with his advisors. Yara Greyjoy sat with arms crossed, eyebrows raised in suspicion. Sarella Sand, representing the Dornish interests, leaned forward with obvious curiosity. "This is madness," a voice called out, though most were too cautious to openly concur. "It's never been done," another said. Jon squared his shoulders. "If it has never been done, it is because we have never before been brought so low by the folly of kings and queens. Perhaps there was never a need. But now, I believe, It is our only chance to prevent further bloodshed." He gestured to Tyrion, who stepped forward. "I, too, have seen the whims of tyrants and the casualties they cause. Some of you might think we can just pick a new monarch and carry on. But haven't we had enough?" Daenerys Targaryen was hailed as the breaker of chains, but she ended up burning a city. Joffrey Baratheon was born a prince, but he was a sadistic boy king. Robert Baratheon, though he helped free us from the Mad King, had little interest in actual governance. I say let us put the power in the hands of a council, chosen by more than mere bloodlines. Sam swallowed his nerves and spoke next, voice trembling at first but growing in conviction. "You may think the small folk are not fit to choose their leaders, but they bear the brunt of our wars. They fight in our armies. They harvest our food. They pay taxes that fill our coffers. I've read in old annals how, long ago, some communities elected leaders from among their own. Look at the Night's Watch. We choose our Lord Commander by vote, and that tradition has lasted for centuries. This can work if we're willing to try." Silence followed Sam's words, tension filling the courtyard. Finally, Sansa Stark's envoy rose. Lady Brienne of Tarth stood at the edge of that group, also wearing the sigil of House Stark, though her loyalties were complex. The envoy, a northern lord named Serwyn, said, "The North remembers what it's like to bend the knee and pay the price for a king's ambitions. We declared the North free. My Lady Sansa has not changed her stance. Yet she also understands that cooperation between the realms is essential to peace. We will hear these proposals, but the North will never again submit to a single ruler." Tyrion bowed slightly. "And you needn't. Each region would retain its own governance. The council would concern itself with matters of realm-wide importance: war, trade, law, and mutual defense. The North could still chart its own course in other respects." Yara Greyjoy spoke next, her voice sharp as the sea wind. "The Iron Islands have always wanted our independence. We have never thrived under the foot of southern kings or queens. If what you say is true, perhaps we can find a place in this new order, but we must be free to hold to our own laws, our own traditions." Jon nodded. "That is the intent. No region should feel subjugated. This is not about forging a single empire, but a coalition of free kingdoms, united by mutual consent." A wave of cautious conversation rippled through the courtyard. Some lords turned to their advisors, huddling in whispers. Others stared coldly at Jon, their expressions unreadable. The day stretched on as Tyrion opened the floor for debate. Many raised practical questions. How would taxes be collected? Who would enforce the laws the council made? What if a region refused to comply with a council decision? Tyrion, Sam, Davos, and Jon took turns answering, though no one claimed to have all the solutions. This was an uncharted path, one that would require compromise and adaptation. But gradually, the once unthinkable idea took on a shape that some began to see as workable, especially as they remembered the horrors that had led them here. By late afternoon, the heat weighed heavily on everyone in the courtyard. Davos called for a recess, and people broke into smaller groups, seeking shade, water, and the chance to negotiate privately. Jon retreated to a corner where Ghost lay stretched on the cool stone, panting softly. He ran his fingers through the direwolf's thick fur, feeling the anxiety knot in his stomach. He realized that setting forth the idea was only the first battle in a long campaign to win hearts and minds. To his surprise, Gendry approached, hesitating briefly before speaking. "I never thanked you," the young lord said, "for legitimizing me." "Well, it was Queen Daenerys, but you convinced her, didn't you?" Jon lifted his gaze. "I only told her the truth, that you'd be a loyal lord if given the chance." Gendry nodded, eyes flicking to the horizon. "My father was a king, though I never knew him. People say I have a claim, but I don't want the throne, not after everything I've seen. Storm's End is enough responsibility. I just want to serve the realm in a way that won't destroy it." He paused, clearing his throat. "If this new council forms, I'll do my part." Jon gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you. We'll need every ally we can get." Not far away, Tyrion and Sam had cornered a group of lesser lords from the Reach, explaining the potential benefits of collective trade agreements. The lords stroked their chins, intrigued by the possibility that stable governance could revive trade routes and boost their coffers. For them, gold spoke loudly, and if the promise of new governance meant fewer unpredictable wars, it might be worth it. As the sun dipped lower, a second session convened. This time, the representatives honed in on the structure of the proposed assembly. Tyrion suggested that each of the 7 kingdoms, plus the Iron Islands, recognized as distinct, select a certain number of delegates, perhaps based on population. The question of who got to vote for those delegates sparked fierce debate. Traditionalists insisted that only landed lords should have a vote. Others, inspired by Sam's idealism, argued that at least prominent merchants, guildmasters, and community leaders should be included. The session devolved into heated arguments. Jon felt the weight of centuries of feudal hierarchy bearing down on him, but Sam's quiet resolve reminded him that if the people were excluded entirely, they would simply replace a king with an oligarchy of lords. In the end, no consensus was reached that day. Tensions were high, and personal rivalries flared. The idea of democracy, or anything resembling it, was so foreign that even open-minded lords balked at handing power to commoners. Yet enough had changed, enough had been destroyed, that those who once scoffed at the mere idea found themselves listening. They had lost brothers, sisters, entire families to the Game of Thrones. The melted hunk of steel that had once been the Iron Throne loomed in everyone's memory. And so they did not walk away. They stayed. They listened. They argued. They negotiated. Jon called for a close of the session before dusk, inviting everyone to stay in the rebuilt quarters or camp in the fields beyond the city. That night, King's Landing was alive with quiet discussion. The taverns that still stood filled with debate, as lesser knights and merchants who had come with their lords talked through the day's events. For many of the small folk who overheard, the notion that they might one day have a voice in choosing leaders seemed too good to be true. Sellswords and hedge knights, who often found themselves cast aside after wars, muttered that at least this new arrangement might offer more stability, if it actually came to pass. Others were skeptical, suspecting it was just another ploy by powerful men. Jon retreated to his chambers, feeling more drained than if he had fought a dozen battles. The door creaked as Tyrion slipped in, a bottle of wine in hand, followed shortly by Sam and Davos. They gathered around a small table, the moonlight bathing the room in silver. Tyrion poured 4 cups. To a realm at peace, Tyrion toasted quietly, though his eyes carried a weary shadow. They all drank, letting the silence rest between them. Jon swallowed the bitter wine, wishing he had Melisandre's visions to tell him if any of this would truly work. "We made progress," Sam ventured, setting his cup down. "More than I expected on the first day." Davos ran a hand over his neatly trimmed beard. But it'll be a tricky business. Even if they agree in principle, the details will decide everything." Tyrion set his cup aside. "We must be careful. If we push too hard, the lords might unite against the idea out of sheer stubbornness. But if we concede too much, we might end up with the same old aristocracy, just under a different name." Jon glanced at Ghost sleeping by the doorway, tail flicking. The dire wolf was at ease now, but danger never truly vanished. "We'll find a way. We have to." The next morning saw the debate continue. Over the course of several days, the plan began to crystallize. In the final arrangement, each of the major regions would send delegates to the new assembly. House lords would still exist. Few were ready to completely dismantle feudalism, but some measure of local election would determine a portion of the delegates. Commoners could stand for election if they met certain criteria, though those criteria were hotly contested. In a compromise, Sam suggested that landowners, guild leaders, and certain recognized community figures could vote. It was not universal suffrage, but it was a step beyond pure aristocracy. The new assembly would then choose, by a majority vote, a protector of the realm. That protector would govern alongside the council but could be removed if he or she overstepped legal boundaries or proved unfit. Laws would require a majority vote of the assembly. The king's, or rather, the protector's, word alone would not suffice. Titles like king or queen were to be abolished for the central ruler. The monarchy as Westeros had known it would end. The final hurdle was convincing each region to sign the Pact of Unity. Over the course of weeks, envoys hammered out details. Yara Greyjoy secured provisions that would allow the Iron Islands to maintain their seafaring traditions and local governance, as long as they abided by the Assembly's maritime laws for the realm. Dorne negotiated the retention of certain cultural practices, with the promise that their delegates would be recognized as equals. The North insisted on maintaining distinct autonomy in certain respects, but it agreed to seat delegates in the Assembly, primarily for the sake of mutual defense and trade. The Vale, the Reach, the Riverlands, the Westerlands, and the Crownlands agreed to the concept, each with their own laundry list of conditions. The Crownlands, ironically, remained somewhat uncertain, as they had always been under direct rule by the monarchy, but now found themselves forging a new identity under an elected system. Throughout these negotiations, Jon's role became less of a ruler and more of a mediator. He was the one who had brokered peace in the final war, the one who had ended Daenerys' reign. Though his heart still ached from that act, the realm saw in him a figure of integrity, a man who did not seek power for its own sake. Because of this, they listened. They fought against the details, but not against the concept as a whole. Tyrion's silver tongue and Sam's earnest scholarship helped smooth over many disagreements. Davos's reputation as an honest man was also invaluable. He reassured the suspicious lords that no hidden agenda lurked behind these reforms. One evening, as the negotiations dragged on, Jon rode out to the Dragon Pit, the once-storied ruin on the hill where they had held a parley with Cersei so long ago. Now it lay scorched and empty. The bones of old dragons might still lie buried beneath the rubble, a testament to how even the mightiest fall to time and fire. He dismounted, allowing ghosts to roam, while he stared at the ancient dome, partially collapsed. He remembered Daenerys there, how she had seemed determined yet full of dreams. He closed his eyes, recalling her final moments, feeling again the stab of regret. Then he opened them, focusing on the battered ruin. He thought of the countless lives lost in the struggle for the throne. His father, his brother, countless innocents. Perhaps, if this new system took hold, future generations would not have to endure the same horrors. A soft rustle behind him indicated another presence. He turned to see Arya, clad in leather, her hair grown a bit longer since last he saw her. She had slipped back into the city without fanfare, typical of her. She offered a faint smile. "You're doing it," she said, her voice quiet yet encouraging. "You're building a world without kings." Jon felt a warmth at seeing his sister. His cousin, truly, though bloodlines mattered little to them now. "Trying," he replied. "It's harder than I imagined, but it feels necessary." Arya nodded, her gaze drifting to the distant towers of King's Landing. "I'm proud of you." She paused, shifting her stance. "I won't stay, though. I've had enough of courts and councils. The world's a big place." She tilted her head, a small grin forming. "But if you ever need someone to remind these lords that they can bleed like everyone else, just send a raven." Jon smiled back, pulling her into an embrace. For a moment, they were children again, huddled in the courtyard of Winterfell, uncertain of the future. Then she slipped away, disappearing as silently as she had come. Jon let out a long breath, returning his gaze to the ruin. The last Stark. He doubted Sansa would ever return to the capital. Her place was in the north. Bran was gone, lost in his own mysterious journeys. Rickon was dead. It fell to him to guide Westeros into this uncharted future. Whether he was truly a Stark or a Targaryen or both seemed irrelevant now. The realm needed all he could give, and he would give it so perhaps the realm could finally know peace. At last, the day arrived when the lords and ladies, having bent logic and tradition nearly to the breaking point, finalized the pact. A large gathering formed once more in the courtyard. The melted Iron Throne's remnants had been placed on a low dais, a reminder of the old ways. Next to that hunk of fused metal stood a new lectern carved from weirwood, signifying new beginnings. Each region's representative approached in turn, reciting the words that bound them to the new council and to the laws they would collectively shape. The hush was profound as Yara Greyjoy took her turn, her voice firm. Lord Serwyn for the North. Ser Bronn of the Blackwater, representing the Crownlands on behalf of the newly dubbed region. Tyrion had arranged that appointment, though he kept a watchful eye on his old friend's greed. Lords from the Reach, the Riverlands, the Vale, and the Westerlands followed. Finally, Sarella Sand, a recognized daughter of Oberyn Martell, affixed her seal for Dorne. Each region took an oath not to resort to arms for settling disputes that fell under the new council's purview. Any region that did so would face the collective might of the others. It was a fragile arrangement, but it was more than Westeros had ever had before in the cause of peace. When the last seal was placed upon the document, a collective exhale swept through the courtyard, as though the realm itself breathed a sigh of relief. Jon stepped forward to address them. The midday sun shone in a brilliant sky, washing the courtyard in a light that seemed unusually pure after all the ash and sorrow. You have all agreed to a new course. This does not erase the wounds of the past, but it gives us a chance for a future not defined by tyranny. We will form the Assembly of the Realm. You will choose a protector to lead, to coordinate, and to serve, but not to rule absolutely. In time, if we remain true to these ideals, perhaps our children will never know a war of succession. Tyrion approached the lectern, clearing his throat. And now we must select our first protector of the realm. By the agreement, the delegates will vote. Whoever attains the majority will serve for 7 years, after which a new vote will be held. This is the final act of our old order, and the first of the new. The delegates consulted among themselves. Some had whispered months ago that Jon would be the obvious choice. Others favored Tyrion or perhaps Gendry Baratheon. A few floated Lord Royce or Edmure Tully. But as the lords and ladies exchanged glances, as they recalled the path that had led them here, they found a surprising level of consensus. The votes were tallied under the watchful eye of Sam and a handful of scribes. One by one, delegates placed a token, a small stone engraved with a name, into a sealed box. When the box was opened and the stones counted, the results were whispered to Sam, who then passed them to Tyrion. Tyrion, in a tone of mild amusement mixed with pride, announced, "The Assembly has spoken. Jon Snow has been chosen as protector of the realm." A ripple of applause and some murmured acceptance ran through the crowd. Jon's jaw tightened. He had hoped someone else might take the mantle, but the trust placed in him was not something he could lightly refuse. He stepped onto the platform, turning to the delegates. "I accept this honor not to rule over you, but to serve this new council. My vow is to uphold our laws, to protect the realm from threats without and within, and to never forget that power belongs to the people who grant it." With that, Sam approached with a simple chain of office, not a crown, not a scepter, but a chain that symbolized service rather than dominion. He placed it around Jon's shoulders. Then, in a nod to the traditions of old, Sam said softly, "May you bear it with wisdom." No one called Jon Snow your grace. Instead, they addressed him as Protector or Lord Protector, if they insisted on a title. Felt strange and new, but also freeing. The monarchy was truly, finally over. In the days that followed, the new assembly held its first sessions in the courtyard, drafting basic guidelines for governance, taxes, trade, and justice. Tyrion was chosen as the assembly's speaker, tasked with moderating debates and keeping order. Sam took on the role of Master of Laws, with Davos as Master of Ships, Gendry as Master of War, and a smattering of other positions being filled by delegates from each region. There was a kind of electric excitement in the air. This was something new, uncertain, but it carried a promise that resonated with many who were weary of endless conflict. Jon received official visitors who came to swear allegiance, not to him personally, but to the new system. He humbly reminded them that their true loyalty was to the realm itself and to the council's laws. Over time, the seeds of democracy, limited though it was by the continued influence of powerful houses, began to take root. Commoners learned that local elections were to be held for certain assembly seats. The notion spread both fear and hope, stirring the small folk in villages, towns, and cities across Westeros. Predictably, some unscrupulous lords tried to manipulate these nascent elections, offering bribes or threatening consequences. But the watchful eyes of the new administration, and a population that had witnessed enough betrayal, meant that such attempts often backfired. Slowly, an awareness grew among the small folk that their word mattered, if only slightly. Life in the capital took on a different rhythm. The Red Keep's primary hall was converted into a meeting chamber for the assembly, with simple wooden benches in place of the ornate furnishings that once adorned the palace. The melted throne remained on display in a small alcove, a grim relic of what once was. Children occasionally wandered in, gazing wide-eyed at the twisted metal, hearing whispered tales of the Dragon Queen who had destroyed an entire city. The city itself began to mend. Shops reopened, houses were rebuilt, and the scent of fresh mortar and cut wood began to overshadow the lingering odor of ash. Refugees returned, finding that there was a genuine attempt at maintaining order without tyranny. It was far from perfect. Crime, corruption, and hunger were still issues, but the systematic cruelty of the past was absent. That alone was a victory of sorts. One afternoon, Jon sat in his modest office, reviewing a stack of parchments. Tyrion had delivered a list of proposed measures to address the realm's pressing needs. Rebuilding roads, establishing official trade routes, funding an expanded city watch to keep order, and considering a new approach to the debts owed to the Iron Bank of Braavos. Everything felt overwhelming. As protector, he was expected to guide the realm's policies, while the assembly debated and voted on them. He missed the simplicity of the north, the crisp wind in the trees, the calm hush of snow. But there was duty here, and perhaps a purpose that justified his sacrifice. He heard a soft knock and called for the person to enter. Sam stepped in, looking weary yet determined. "We need your voice in the assembly, Jon," he said, holding a small sheaf of documents. "There's a debate on whether we should create a realm-wide code of justice that replaces the patchwork laws across the Seven Kingdoms. Some are resistant, especially those who cling to their old customs. But we have a chance to unify the realm under a fair system." Jon stood, exhaling. "Let's go." They walked through the corridors to the old throne room, now teeming with delegates. Tyrion stood on a raised platform at the front, trying to maintain order as multiple lords spoke over each other. The topic was indeed the realm-wide code of justice, a plan Sam had advocated, drawing upon the precedents of King Jaehaerys' time, mixed with the revised statutes that Tyrion had drafted. Jon took his seat at the central table, a symbolic position. Ice turned to him expectantly. The debate quieted, if only a bit, to hear the protector's stance. Jon, never one for long speeches, spoke plainly. "We have a chance to ensure that justice does not change from castle to castle. If we can agree on a core set of laws and a fair method of enforcement, then all our people, highborn and low, will know where they stand. They'll know that traveling from the north to Dorne won't land them in trouble because of differences in local laws. This code won't erase our customs, but it will ensure no one is above the law." A robed delegate from Dorne argued that local traditions around inheritance and marriage must remain untouched. A Westerlands representative complained that the Lannisters had their own centuries-old practices of taxation and justice. The conversation threatened to spiral into chaos again until Tyrion hammered a small gavel and motioned for a recess. He knew they would have to draft carefully, allowing certain regional customs while establishing core rights and procedures that spanned the entire realm. It would be a drawn-out process, but the momentum was there. The delegates had already accepted the principle of unified governance. Now it was a matter of hashing out the details. Weeks turned to months as the assembly found its footing. Corruption and personal rivalries emerged, as they always do when power is on the table. Yet there was a crucial difference. No single individual could impose their will with a dragon or a royal decree. The combined will of the council could stand against any lord who overreached, and the master of laws, guided by Sam's thorough approach, gained a reputation for fairness. Tyrion's quick wit and willingness to broker compromises kept the system running, if sometimes precariously. Davos's down-to-earth nature made him a favorite among many delegates, who saw him as a man unafraid to roll up his sleeves for the common good. Slowly, life improved. Merchant ships once more sailed into Blackwater Bay, carrying spices from Dorne, wheat from the Reach, silver from the Vales mines, and fish from the Iron Islands. The roads, once patrolled by bandits and leftover sellswords, became safer under a newly standardized city watch expanded to highways and smaller towns, paid for by a tax levied across the realm. This measure itself was contentious, but after a fierce debate, the Assembly passed it by a narrow majority. Lords who once complained bitterly about new taxes found that the increased security boosted trade, enriching them in turn. Reluctantly, some began to appreciate the new system. King's Landing, while still scarred, began to bustle with new energy. Markets reopened, children played in streets that were no longer filled with rubble, and the ordinary pace of city life resumed, albeit with a cautious eye on the changes in governance. Word spread to the far reaches of the continent that this new administration actually listened, at least somewhat, to grievances from common folk. Surprising stories emerged, like that of a blacksmith who petitioned the Assembly to regulate out-of-town armorers to ensure fair pricing. When the measure was seriously considered in committee, many realized this was not the same Westeros where a common voice was ignored. Jon Snow, for his part, found both fulfillment and sadness in his role. The nightmares of war still haunted him, and he had few close confidants beyond Sam, Tyrion, and Davos. Ghost remained his most constant companion, wandering the halls of the Red Keep at night, a silent sentinel. Jon occasionally received ravens from Sansa, who oversaw the North's slow recovery from the wars. She wrote of fortifying the giftlands near the Wall, helping battered smallfolk rebuild their lives, and ensuring that the new northern delegates to the Assembly remained steadfast to northern interests. Arya's letters were rarer, but they came from distant lands across the Sunset Sea, describing wonders that made Jon marvel at the vastness of the world. Sometimes, he would climb to the top of a repaired turret in the Red Keep and gaze northward, remembering Winterfell's cold halls. He missed the crisp snow, the hush of the Godswood, the quiet belonging he once felt. But his vow to protect the realm bound him here. He took solace in the knowledge that, perhaps, his labor here was preventing future wars, preserving countless lives that would otherwise be lost in another destructive conflict. On lonely nights, he lit a candle in the Red Keep's sept, not praying to the Seven, but simply marking the memory of those he had lost. Robb, Ned, Daenerys, and so many more. He whispered words of apology to Daenerys sometimes, though he knew it changed nothing. The realm had demanded it, and he had answered. Now, in her memory, he worked to ensure no one else would be consumed by the madness of absolute power. As the seasons turned, the experiment in democracy, or at least partial democracy, began to show signs of endurance. The Assembly, though riddled with factions, passed legislation to rebuild the Riverlands, which had been devastated repeatedly in past conflicts. They standardized certain taxes, allocated funds for the repair of the King's Road, and worked on treaties with the free cities, many of which were now intrigued by the new form of government in Westeros. A few delegates even proposed forging an alliance with the newly reformed Night's Watch, offering them resources to maintain a minimal presence at the Wall. Though the threat of the White Walkers had been quelled, the Watchers on the Wall were not entirely disbanded, preferring vigilance to complacency. Meanwhile, across the narrow sea, rumors circulated of exiled nobles who once dreamed of reclaiming the Iron Throne. But with the monarchy dissolved and the new system gaining legitimacy, those claims held little weight. Bravos, in particular, found it easier to deal with an assembly than a single monarch. The Iron Bank's representatives worked out a structured repayment plan for the realm's debts, with the assurance that no single warlike ruler would default on them. Merchants from Pentos and Volantis began visiting King's Landing more frequently, drawn by the stability that emerged from collective governance. Still, not all was harmonious. Factions formed in the Assembly, some favoring more power to the commoners, others pushing to maintain aristocratic privileges. Disputes over land rights flared, and sometimes committees became mired in endless debate. Tyrion once quipped that spending a day in the Assembly made him yearn for the simpler days of being kidnapped by hill tribes. But the point was that these disputes, however fiery, largely remained in the realm of words and votes rather than swords and flames. When violence did threaten to erupt, like a minor uprising by a discontented lord in the Reach, the Assembly's combined forces intervened swiftly, arresting the instigators. Trials were held under the new Code of Justice, and those found guilty were punished accordingly. The demonstration of a collective defense, rather than a single monarch's vengeance, dissuaded other malcontents. After roughly a year of this new governance, the day came for the first set of local elections in the Crownlands, an event that would serve as a model for other regions. Candidates ranged from minor lords to merchant guild representatives and even a few charismatic commoners. The idea that a blacksmith, brewer, or shipwright could stand for office both excited and baffled onlookers. Many predicted the aristocracy would dominate, but to everyone's surprise, one seat was won by an articulate woman who ran a bakery in Flea Bottom. Her impassioned speeches about the need for bread subsidies and fair grain prices resonated with the city's poorer districts, and enough local notables supported her to secure her victory. John watched the results with cautious optimism. He recognized that these were baby steps, that the realm would not transform overnight into some utopia. But they were steps nonetheless, away from a system that crushed dreams under the heels of dragons and tyrants. Amid all these changes, John never forgot the looming question. Would the realm truly accept this new order in the long run? Feudal loyalties ran deep. House names like Tyrell, Lannister, Tully, Stark, Martell, and Greyjoy still carried immense weight. But each day that passed without a new war was a small victory. Each law passed with consent of a diverse assembly, each region's acceptance of a newly unified justice code, each local election, each peasant who saw that power might be checked. Those were the building blocks of a new Westeros. And so, the seasons advanced, carrying the realm further from the final war that had melted the Iron Throne and closer to an uncertain yet hopeful future. Tales spread of a land no longer ruled by a single monarch, but by a council representing many voices. The small folk spoke of Jon Snow, the man who could have claimed a king's title but refused. They whispered that he loved the realm more than he loved a crown. Some called him the White Wolf, the protector who wore no crown. Others called him simply Jon, as if he were both highborn and humble, a figure of transformation for a battered kingdom. It was not a perfect realm. Factions jockeyed for influence. Corruption lurked in corners. But the wheel was cracked, perhaps not fully broken, but certainly damaged enough that no single tyrant could spin it unchecked. The North engaged in trade with the Crownlands without fear of forced fealty. The Iron Islands sent delegates who learned to compromise rather than raid. Dorne, so proud of its independence, found a voice in shaping policies that affected all corners of the realm. Even the Westerlands, once the seat of Lannister power, participated in forging a new identity free from the shadow of the old monarchy. One evening, after an especially long assembly session, Jon sat alone on a balcony overlooking the courtyard. The moon hung full and bright, illuminating the newly rebuilt city. Candles flickered in windows across the skyline, a testament to the lives continuing despite all that had happened. He could hear distant laughter from a tavern, the soft neighing of horses from the stables, and the hush of the wind rustling through newly planted trees. Ghost lay at his feet, ears perked at the night sounds. Jon found himself thinking of Ned Stark and the honor he had lived by, of Daenerys, who had wanted to free the world and ended up destroying so much of it, of the small mercies and small victories that had led them to this new path. He glanced at the chain around his neck, a simple symbol of office, not a crown, felt both heavy and liberating. Tomorrow, the Assembly would debate expansions to the Code of Justice, or perhaps new infrastructure projects or foreign trade agreements. More talk, more negotiations, more compromises, but also more hope, more collective effort, more unity than Westeros had known in generations. He closed his eyes, letting the cool night air wash over him. In his mind's ear, he could almost hear the ghostly roar of a dragon, the rumble of an army on the march, the echoes of swords clashing in that final cataclysmic war. Yet those echoes receded against the steady hum of life that blossomed in the city below. The realm was healing, however slowly, and the power that once sat upon a single throne was diffused among many. It would take vigilance, wisdom, and patience to see this fragile democracy endure. But for the first time in living memory, Westeros was not defined by the hunger for a crown or the terror of losing it. Its fate, for better or worse, had been placed in the hands of its people and their representatives. And so Jon Snow, the man who had seen the horrors beyond the wall, who had faced dragons and kings, who had loved and lost and borne unimaginable guilt, found a certain measure of peace in this new order. He did not claim moral superiority or infallibility. He knew mistakes would be made, that conflicts would arise, that injustice would creep in as it always did. But there was a mechanism now, however imperfect, to correct those wrongs, to challenge power, to demand accountability. If that was not the perfect breaking of the wheel, it was at least the forging of something new in its place. A governance shaped by the many, tempered by debate, and inspired by the dream that no single person should ever again hold the fate of the realm in a clenched fist. The night deepened, and he remained there for a long time, watching the city and listening to its heartbeat. The burden was immense, but he felt no urge to flee. Duty had always guided him. Love had once guided him too, though it cost him dearly. Now, hope guided him, not just his own, but that of thousands who had endured the destruction of a system too cruel to stand. Let the cynics doubt, let the lords squabble. In time, the memory of that melted throne might remind them all of what unchecked power could do. He rose, ghost at his side, and stepped back into the corridors of the Red Keep. He would rest a few hours before another day of debate, legislation, and cautious progress. Each decision was a small brick in the edifice of the new Westeros, an unfinished structure, but one in which every voice mattered, and where no single person could declare, "I am the realm." Jon Snow, protector of Westeros, was determined to see that promise kept, so that long after he was gone, the realm would endure without a single occupant of a dreadful Iron Throne. In that, he believed, lay the only true peace that Westeros had ever known. And if it held, then all the sacrifice, all the loss, might at last gain meaning under a sky free from the shadow of kings. Jon Snow awoke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the tall window of his chamber. The morning air carried the faint brine of Blackwater Bay, a reminder that King's Landing, though battered and changed, was still a city of many scents and secrets. He stretched his stiff muscles, recalling the late hours he'd spent in the assembly hall the night before. Already his head was spinning with the challenges awaiting him. The petition to revise maritime laws for the Iron Islands, the continuing debates over the realm-wide code of justice, the proposed budget for the City Watch, and dozens of smaller concerns that only seem small until you realize they affected real people's lives. He rose without ceremony, dressed simply, and made his way into the corridor, Ghost padding at his side. The dire wolf was a comforting presence, silently reminding Jon of who he truly was beneath the title of protector of the realm. Courtiers and officials crossing the hall stepped aside, some bowing respectfully, others offering small salutes. Jon answered them with nods, keeping his stride purposeful. Even after nearly a year and a half in this position, he felt uneasy at the regard people showed him. He was not a king, nor did he want to be, but in a way that only made them respect him more, the man who had refused a crown and accepted a burden. When he entered the council chamber, once used for the monarch's small council, now repurposed for daily administrative meetings, he found Tyrion already in mid-conversation with Sam and Gendry. Tyrion, perched on a high stool, was gesticulating with a quill in one hand while Gendry wore a perplexed frown, arms crossed. Sam, who had grown more confident in his role as master of laws, had stacks of parchment arrayed before him. "All I'm saying," Tyrion was saying, eyebrows raised high, "is that if we continue to let each region charge different tolls for crossing their borders, trade will get tangled in 1,000 local rules. We need uniform tolls, one rate for the entire realm, so merchants can move freely without fear of extortion. That's what a unified realm means." Gendry grunted. "I understand the logic, but the lords in the Stormlands complain that if they charge the same low rate as the Vale or the Crownlands, they won't collect enough revenue for their local roads. They'll say the Stormlands have more winding passes and more labor costs to maintain them." Tyrion's lips pursed. "Yes, that's what everyone says. My region is special, we need more. Then they undercut each other. Suddenly, trade becomes chaotic. We need a standard. Sam pushed his parchment aside and glanced at John. Maybe we can include a provision that regions can impose a modest surcharge if they can prove their terrain is more difficult to maintain. He shrugged, expression tentative. But it has to be regulated somehow, or each region will exploit loopholes. The entire point of a single code is consistency. John listened quietly, noting the tension in their voices. Already, the complexities of uniting 8, counting the Iron Islands separately, distinct regions under shared laws had grown more daunting than any battlefield he'd ever faced. But he did see progress. The fact that they were here, trying to find a compromise through discussion rather than raising armies, was itself a triumph in this new era. He sighed and leaned against the edge of the table. We're all still learning how to do this, he said. But I'd rather see us struggle with words than with swords. Keep at it, find a balance. Let the lords from the Stormlands bring their arguments openly, and we'll see if the Assembly can draft a fair compromise. Tyrion set the quill down and nodded. It's like herding cats. But yes, I suppose we'll manage. Sam's eyes lit up with a new thought. We might look to the old records from the Age of Heroes. The North and the Vale once had an agreement over shared roads, though that was centuries before the conquest. Tyrion raised a brow. You never cease to amaze me, Samwell, but do rummage for that if you can. Any precedent might ease the negotiations. John ran his hand over Ghost's head as the direwolf settled at his feet. What's next on the schedule today? Gendry rummaged through his notes. There's the Iron Islands petition. Yara Greyjoy claims the new maritime laws restricting raids on foreign coasts are harming her people's way of life. She wants to negotiate a clause so that if they raid in Essos, it won't be considered piracy. She insists it's part of their culture. John closed his eyes briefly, recalling the burning villages and stolen children that once defined the Ironborn reputation. Yara had sworn to keep the Ironborn from reaving Westeros, but they had always tested the boundaries of their newfound membership in this evolving government. Still, she had cooperated thus far, focusing on trade and fishing fleets to rebuild her domain. Perhaps she truly believed that paying reavers a stipend to remain on the Isles was unsustainable. We'll have to discuss it, but I won't allow the Iron Islands to simply become legalized pirates. The Assembly was clear that we want an end to the old ways of Ironborn raids. We can't keep violence out of Westeros only to export it overseas. Tyrion tapped his fingers on the table. Indeed, the Free Cities won't take kindly if we sanction raids on their coastlines. That could lead to a messy conflict we're not prepared for. We'll negotiate, Sam said gently, sounding like a teacher who had to handle a difficult student. Perhaps we can help them develop new industries or invest in shipbuilding. Yara might accept a path to wealth that doesn't rely on raiding, especially if it's profitable enough. John nodded, glancing at Gendry. Draft a plan to present to her. Tyrion, perhaps you and Davos can work on a trade deal with Braavos that offers the Ironborn a role as transporters or escorts for shipping vessels. If they can't raid, maybe they can guard merchant ships. There's money to be made in safe passage. A faint smile tugged at Tyrion's lips, turning the Ironborn into a mercantile navy. I do love it when old dogs learn new tricks. Let's try. They continued discussing smaller matters, staffing the harbor patrol, responding to a dispute over farmland boundaries in the Riverlands, and preparing for the next assembly session. Eventually, the group broke up, and John took a moment to breathe in the open air by one of the half-rebuilt balconies. King's Landing sprawled below him, still marred by sections of burnt ruins, but rising from the ashes with new vigor. The noise of rebuilding was constant. Hammering, shouting, the creak of pulleys lifting stones. Yet far from being oppressive, it was hopeful. Each blow of a hammer was a note in the symphony of rebirth. He scanned the horizon, remembering times when that same view was dominated by the silhouette of a dragon. The memory of Drogon and Daenerys was never far. He let the guilt stab at him for a moment before he exhaled, reminding himself why he was doing all this. He told himself that this new system, if it truly took root, might be the only lasting monument to her original dream of breaking the wheel, twisted though that dream had become in her final days. That afternoon, the assembly convened again in the old throne room, now set with semicircular benches and a central dais for debate. The melted remnants of the Iron Throne remained on display off to the side, a silent testament to what once ruled them. Every so often, visitors would approach the fused mass of swords with a hushed reverence, or perhaps fear. It was rumored that people saw shapes in the twisted metal, faces of those lost, or the snarl of a dragon's maw. Whether that was true or simple imagination, John did not know. Delegates trickled in, some from ancient houses, others representing newly formed constituencies. The Crownlands had recently conducted an election for 2 seats, and a blacksmith's daughter now sat near a minor lord from Rosby. That small victory for the common people had rippled across the realm, though in many places, lords still controlled who was eligible to represent the area. But the seeds of broader participation were sown. Some delegates from the Reach had begun to speak openly of expanding the vote to more farmers and tradesmen, seeing it as a way to undermine the power of old rivals. John supposed that was progress, even if born from petty politics. He took his seat at the central table, where Tyrion, Speaker of the Assembly, stood to address the gathered representatives. Sam, Davos, Gendry, and a rotating cast of lesser officials flanked them. The chatter in the hall subsided slowly as delegates recognized the signal to begin. Tyrion rapped a small wooden hammer on the table. "We call this session of the Assembly to order. First item, a vote on the revised toll policies among the Vale, the Stormlands, and the Crownlands. Our scribes have distributed the final draft of the measure. I trust everyone has read it." A few delegates nodded. Others looked sheepish, as if they'd only skimmed the parchment or not read it at all. Still, no one admitted outright ignorance. Tyrion continued, summarizing the measure. A base toll rate across the realm for common roads, with a possible surcharge for especially difficult terrain or roads requiring extensive maintenance. Each region that wanted such a surcharge had to petition the Assembly's Infrastructure Committee. The debate began with a storm of voices, some praising the measure as fair, others accusing it of being too lenient or too stringent. Lord Royce from the Vale spoke up, pointing out that the Vale's mountainous roads required constant upkeep, so they should be allowed a higher surcharge. A representative from the Riverlands retorted that some roads near the Trident had frequent flooding, which was just as costly to maintain. A man from the Stormlands insisted that their passes and coastal cliffs were uniquely treacherous. Tyrion, accustomed to such wrangling, carefully recorded their points, while Sam occasionally interjected with references to old legal precedents or proposed amendments. John listened for a long while, letting them talk. The power of the new system was in these very arguments, the chance for different perspectives to collide without violence. After an hour, the factions had largely staked their ground. Tyrion called a short recess, letting the delegates negotiate on the side. Then, once they reconvened, a final version of the measure was put to a vote. The result was closer than John had expected, but it passed. A wave of murmured acceptance spread through the hall, followed by scattered applause. Tyrion, looking mildly triumphant, scribbled the official count on a ledger. John stood, addressing them. "This measure might seem like a small thing, but it's an example of how we can work together to solve issues that once led to armed disputes. The realm is large and diverse, and each of your regions faces different challenges. May this vote serve as a precedent for future cooperation." A few heads nodded solemnly. Others looked merely relieved that the debate was over. Tyrion rapped the hammer again and announced the next agenda item, the Iron Islands petition. Yara Greyjoy, sitting with a pair of Ironborn delegates, rose to present her case. She tried to strike a diplomatic tone, though the swagger in her posture betrayed her confidence in the Ironborn's storied ferocity. She spoke of her people's traditions, how they had always been reavers, how the Iron Islands lacked resources to sustain a large population without raiding or heavy trade. She argued that while they respected the new laws, the Ironborn needed to conduct limited expeditions across the narrow sea if they were to remain strong and not become impoverished. Murmurs arose in the hall. Some delegates from the Reach or the Westerlands glowered, remembering old raids that had cost them dearly. Yara continued, raising her voice a bit. I've held my people back from attacking your lands. We've kept the peace. Yet we're hemmed in with only fishing and meager mining. We can't sustain ourselves on fair trade alone. Not unless you open more shipping routes that we can dominate. She shrugged. We're not merchants by nature. But if the Assembly grants us the legal right to escort or protect merchant vessels at a fair wage, perhaps that can be our new way of life. Jon exchanged a glance with Tyrion, so she was already pivoting toward the plan they'd discussed. That was promising, though it came with a price. She proposed a schedule of fees that the Ironborn would charge for each ship they guarded, plus a guarantee from the realm that if certain Ironborn ships acted questionably in Essos, the Assembly would not brand them outlaws, so long as they did not attack friendly ports. The debate went on for another 2 hours. A few delegates expressed disgust at the idea of legitimizing Ironborn muscle abroad. Others claimed that if the Ironborn didn't find a lawful path to profit, they'd return to Reaving no matter what. In the end, Davos Seaworth delivered a measured speech, reminding everyone how crucial the Ironborn fleet had once been in battles past, and how the new realm could use strong seafarers on its side, provided they were kept under fair oversight. A final compromise was reached. The Assembly would encourage the Ironborn to become official escorts for merchant ships traveling to and from Essos, under strict guidelines prohibiting them from raiding or attacking any allied ports. Violations would lead to immediate condemnation and a realm-wide warrant for the offender's arrest. Yara, though not ecstatic, accepted it. It was a path for her people to earn gold in line with the law, and it allowed them to retain some sense of their proud maritime heritage. By the time the Assembly adjourned, twilight had fallen. Jon, exhausted, walked out into the courtyard with Tyrion and Davos. Workers had lit torches along the walls, and the smoky glow revealed glimpses of scaffolding where masons repaired a battered tower. In the distance, the top of the Red Keep was still blackened from dragonfire. Despite all the efforts, some scars of the war would never fully disappear. Tyrion rolled his shoulders. Not a bad day's work. We might actually see a future where the Ironborn sail as our realm's maritime protectors instead of raiders. He chuckled wearily. Stranger things have happened, I suppose. Davos gave a half-smile. If it keeps the peace, I'll take it. Not sure I'll ever get used to seeing Ironborn flaunting their new, respectable status, though. Jon watched as Yara and her companions headed toward the harbor, presumably to celebrate or plan their next steps. We've prevented at least one crisis. There'll be more, but it's worth it. They parted ways. Tyrion to meet with a group of Crownlands delegates, Davos to inspect some new ships, and Jon to find a moment of quiet. He wandered through the Red Keep's corridors until he reached a small courtyard garden that had been mostly spared by the flames. There, a single weirwood sapling was growing, transplanted from the north. Its pale trunk and red leaves provided a stark contrast to the southern architecture. Sansa had overseen its planting, insisting that even if the north remained distinct, King's Landing needed a connection to the old gods as well. Jon stood before the sapling, listening to the rustle of its leaves in the gentle breeze. He wondered how Sansa fared. He only received her letters once every few weeks. She remained in Winterfell, guiding the North's own budding form of local councils. The northern delegates in King's Landing had begun to reflect that changing structure, but the North still saw itself as a separate kingdom. It had joined the new assembly primarily for mutual defense and trade, carefully preserving its autonomy in cultural matters. Jon respected that choice, and thus far it had not caused major conflict. Yet he couldn't help but feel the distance between them, between the family he had left behind and the role he now filled. He closed his eyes and inhaled the night air, letting it center him. Then he turned and made his way back inside, readying himself for the next day's tasks. The pattern of governance established itself more firmly over the following months. Elections took place in stages across various regions, each with its own rules, some more open than others. Tyrion and Sam worked tirelessly to standardize the process, but old habits died hard. Many lords found ways to manipulate the local electorate, restricting who could vote or stand for office. Bribery was common in certain pockets. Yet, compared to the old system where power was inherited without question, it felt like a sea change. People whispered in taverns about the possibility of representation, even if limited. The very idea that a blacksmith's daughter, a fisherman's son, or a skilled scribe could eventually become a recognized representative was enough to stir hope in places where hope had once been scarce. John found himself busier than ever as protector of the realm. Though the lawmaking power resided in the assembly, many still sought him out for guidance or mediation. He was invited to ceremonies in the Reach celebrating harvest festivals, to the reopened mines of the Westerlands, to the newly fortified border towns in the Riverlands. Every trip reminded him how vast and diverse Westeros was, and how much it had suffered. The people greeted him with a mixture of gratitude and reverence, calling him the White Wolf, the man who had ended the final war. Some even called him the king who refused a crown, and while the label made him uneasy, it also helped unify them in a sense of shared purpose. On one such trip, he traveled to the Vale, invited by Lord Royce to witness the expansion of mountain roads that were now under partial realm-wide funding. The winding path up to the Eyrie was as perilous as ever, but the improvements made it more accessible for trade caravans. John took in the breathtaking views of snow-capped peaks and deep valleys. The wind whipped against him and Ghost, who padded along with quiet vigilance. During a formal feast in the Eyries' Great Hall, Lord Royce toasted to the new realm, proclaiming that for the first time in generations, the Vale felt included in decisions that shaped Westeros as a whole. John, though not fond of feasts, accepted the praise with humility. He spent the evening discussing future developments, fortifications, a possible Vale representative on the infrastructure committee, and left the next morning, eager to return to the more practical tasks in King's Landing. But not all corners of Westeros embraced the changes so wholeheartedly. Whispers reached the capital of certain lords who resented the power of the assembly, seeing it as a threat to their ancient privileges. One of these was a band of minor lords in the Westerlands who had begun hoarding grain and gold, hoping to starve out the new system until it collapsed, so that a single ruler, perhaps a Lannister restoration, could rise again. The rumors lacked clarity, but they were enough to concern Tyrion, whose ties to the Westerlands were personal and deep. To quell such unrest, Tyrion organized a diplomatic mission to his former homeland, inviting Jon, Sam, and a handful of other delegates to accompany him. They set out by carriage and horseback, traveling the Gold Road westward. Along the way, they inspected the newly reopened gold mines near the ruins of the old Lannister seat, Casterly Rock. The seat was still under partial repair, a testament to how the wars had affected even the most storied castles. Tyrion, wearing a resigned expression, pointed out half-collapsed towers and scorched sections of the fortress that once symbolized Lannister might. They met with local lords, many of whom eyed Tyrion with lingering suspicion, as though blaming him for House Lannister's decline. But they also recognized that the power now lay with the assembly. Despite their private grumbling, they dared not openly defy the new realm-wide government. Over several tense days of negotiation, Jon and Tyrion hammered out agreements to ensure fair distribution of gold profits and grain stocks. Sam explained the laws ensuring no region could hoard essential resources in times of need, referencing newly passed measures about resource sharing in crisis. The lords, seeing that open defiance would lead to retribution from the combined might of multiple regions, ultimately agreed to abide by the new laws, albeit with reluctance. It was not love that brought them to compliance, but fear of unified opposition. That night, the delegation stayed in a refurbished wing of Casterly Rock. Tyrion roamed the corridors in a melancholic haze, occasionally offering wry remarks about how the halls seemed smaller than in his childhood memories. He pointed out a hidden passage he used to explore as a boy, behind a tapestry of a roaring lion, now moth-eaten and partially scorched. Sam followed him eagerly, curiosity shining in his eyes. Jon trailed behind, listening more than speaking, absorbing the quiet sadness that clung to these stones. Eventually, Tyrion led them to a small balcony overlooking the sea. The roar of waves crashing against the cliffs reverberated below. Moonlight silvered the waters, and a salty breeze stirred their cloaks. Tyrion rested his hands on the balustrade, shoulders tense. All my life, I believed House Lannister was an unshakable pillar. Now I see it was just as mortal as any other house. My sister, my father, my brother, all gone. And here we are, forging a realm where no single house stands above the rest. Sam offered a tentative smile. If it's any consolation, your knowledge and leadership have helped shape this new system. You're ensuring no house goes through that kind of fall again. At least not because of one person's madness. Tyrion grunted. I suppose so, though it's strange to think I was once certain the name Lannister would live forever in glory. He turned to Jon, eyes reflecting the moonlight. And you, Jon? Do you ever think about your old allegiances, Stark, Targaryen? Jon pressed his lips together. I never felt I belonged to the Targaryen side. As for Stark, that's who I am at heart. But right now I serve the realm, not a single house. And I'm content with that. They stood in companionable silence for a while, the moon tracing a path across the waves. Despite the tension of the negotiations, they had secured the Westerlands' cooperation. That alone was a victory worth savoring. Upon returning to King's Landing, Jon found a raven waiting for him, a message from Sansa. He read it in private, Ghost nuzzling his shoulder as if sensing his bittersweet anticipation. She wrote that the North was flourishing now that the harvest had been bountiful. Many smaller folk, once left unprotected, had found refuge in communities rebuilt under her leadership. She also mentioned that the North's local councils had passed a measure guaranteeing some say to lesser houses and village leaders, though it stopped far short of full elections. She made no apology for preserving the North's autonomy, only stating that she hoped to maintain amicable relations with the rest of Westeros under the new system. The letter ended with a simple note. Winterfell remembers your sacrifices, Jon. May the gods keep you safe. Her signature, just Sansa Stark, brought a lump to his throat. He folded the parchment carefully, slipping it into a drawer. He had no illusions that the new system was perfect. Conflicts still flared, and sometimes it seemed like half the realm wanted to cheat or circumvent the Assembly's laws. Yet there was a consistent thread. Problems were dealt with through negotiation, threats of collective enforcement, or legal measures. Rarely did disputes escalate to full-blown violence. Each day that passed without a major uprising felt like a small miracle. The battered realm was healing, forging a new identity, cautiously, messily, but steadily. The turning of the seasons approached, and with it, a question began to stir among the populace. Jon's initial term as protector of the realm was nearing its halfway point. By the new charter, each protector served a 7-year term, subject to a vote of confidence if the Assembly found grave wrongdoing. Rumors swirled. Would Jon seek another term when the time came? Would the realm choose someone else? In the old days, such speculation wouldn't exist. Kings reigned for life. Now, the very idea that the highest executive in the realm might step down or be replaced peacefully was a shock to tradition. Some lords, ironically, had grown attached to Jon's leadership. His reluctance to wield power as an autocrat made them feel safer, trusting that he wouldn't arbitrarily punish them. Merchants found him fair-minded. Commoners admired him for his humility and his storied past. Yet there were also those who felt he was too lenient, too enamored of compromise. They believed a more forceful protector could accelerate reforms or secure the realm's dominance abroad. The question hung over every new policy debate, fueling talk in corridors and taverns alike. Jon tried to ignore the rumors, focusing instead on the day-to-day tasks of governing. Yet he couldn't escape the feeling that part of him would be relieved to relinquish the mantle when the time came. He missed the North, missed simpler times despite the dangers they had held. Still, the realm needed stability. Would it risk tearing itself apart if he stepped aside too soon? As the second year of the new Assembly dawned, a fresh challenge emerged from beyond Westeros's shores. Envoys arrived from Volantis, speaking of an emboldened triarchy that had begun expanding its influence across the narrow sea. Merchant ships from Westeros were subjected to increased taxes or outright harassment near certain ports. Reports of seized cargo filtered in. The Free Cities, Bravos, Pentos, Lys each had their own stake in the region, leading to a complex web of alliances. Suddenly, the assembly found itself facing a foreign policy crisis unlike anything it had yet encountered. Tyrion and Davos, among others, argued that Westeros must stand firm to protect its shipping lanes. If the Triarchy or any city-state believed Westeros was weak or divided, they might prey on its merchants. Gendry spoke of mobilizing a portion of the realm's navy, newly consolidated under the Assembly, to patrol the Narrow Sea. Others worried that this would spark a larger conflict, dragging a fragile Westeros into war overseas. Jon frowned at the thought. They had promised the realm peace. Was it worth risking conflict over trade disputes? In an urgent assembly session, delegates debated how to respond. Some favored a diplomatic mission to Volantis, offering a trade agreement that could appease the Triarchy. Others insisted on a show of force, positioning the Ironborn-led escort fleets near contested waters to demonstrate that Westeros would protect its own. Yara Greyjoy, for her part, seemed eager to prove the Ironborn's value in a naval standoff, though she insisted on a clear set of rules of engagement. Sam urged caution, citing the realm's exhaustion from recent wars and the need to build alliances carefully. After days of heated discussion, a compromise emerged. Westeros would send a diplomatic delegation to Volantis, led by Tyrion, with full authority to negotiate fair trade terms and an end to harassment of Westerosi ships. Simultaneously, a modest naval force, including Ironborn vessels and Crownland's war galleys, would patrol key routes, refraining from aggression unless attacked. Jon agreed with this course. It balanced deterrence with diplomacy, hopefully avoiding a spark that could lead to another war. Tyrion set sail for Volantis within the week, accompanied by a small retinue of negotiators, scribes, and guards. Jon remained behind, coordinating with Davos and Gendry to ensure the naval patrols were conducted responsibly. For a tense month, the realm waited, eyes on the sea. Rumors of skirmishes, real or imagined, spread. Some insisted that the Triarchy was preparing a larger fleet to strike. Others said Volantis wanted a straightforward deal, that the Triarchs merely tested Westeros's resolve. At last, a raven arrived from Tyrion in Volantis. He wrote that negotiations were challenging but not impossible. The Triarchy demanded higher tariffs, citing the need to maintain their own fleets and fortifications. Tyrion countered by offering access to Westeros's raw materials, lumber, grain, even precious metals from the Westerlands, at fair rates. If Volantis reduced taxes on Westerosi ships, the letter ended optimistically, suggesting a treaty might be within reach. Jon exhaled in relief upon reading Tyrion's words aloud to the assembly. The delegates murmured with cautious optimism. A few weeks later, Tyrion himself returned, disembarking at King's Landing with a triumphant grin. He carried a sealed document from Volantis, outlining a 5-year trade agreement with a mutual non-aggression clause. Tariffs would be set at stable, predictable rates. In exchange, Westeros would open more of its ports to Volantene merchants, ensuring a profitable exchange on both sides. There were no illusions that the Triarchy was suddenly a steadfast ally, but this success demonstrated that Westeros, under an assembly-led system, could conduct foreign policy effectively. As the realm celebrated this diplomatic triumph, Jon recognized it as a milestone. Westeros was no longer a land beholden to one royal figure whose personality dictated alliances. It was a collective entity forging agreements through representatives. Such an arrangement, though cumbersome, had proven workable. The peoples of the Seven Kingdoms and the Iron Islands and partly the North were finding a unified voice in the wider world. But successes did not mean an end to all troubles. Corruption and nepotism still reared their heads within the assembly. Jon frequently received reports of delegates accepting bribes to vote certain ways. Sam did his best to investigate and, when evidence was strong, bring formal charges. In the old days, such charges might never see the light of day. Now, they led to public trials in front of the assembly, presided over by a panel of justices who had been appointed for their reputed fairness, although even that was hotly contested. Some delegates were stripped of office, disgraced before their constituents. The threat of a trial became a powerful deterrent, if not a complete cure for human greed. Perhaps, Jon mused, no system could wholly eradicate corruption, But at least now there was a mechanism to confront it. Meanwhile, the realm's infrastructure continued to improve. Roads were gradually repaired or built anew, linking towns that once languished in isolation. Trading posts sprang up at crossroads, forging connections between distant regions. In the north, Sansa established a corridor of trade with the Vale, exchanging pelts, timber, and fish for grain, steel, and manufactured goods. The Iron Islands, newly flush with coin from their escort services, invested in small shipyards. Some younger Ironborn chafed at the loss of the old reaving ways, but many grudgingly admitted they were better fed and housed now than they had been under the uncertain spoils of pillaging. 2 more years passed in relative stability, with the occasional local crisis but no realm-wide catastrophe. Jon found himself growing older, lines of care deepening on his face. Ghost had a few more gray hairs around his muzzle, though the direwolf remained as formidable and protective as ever. Tyrion, for his part, seemed revitalized by the challenges of forging the new governance. Sam and Gilly, now with a second child, split their time between the city and Horn Hill, where Sam's family lands were gradually reconciled under a more tolerant approach. Davos oversaw the expansion of the realm's navy, ensuring each region contributed ships or men, so that the burden did not fall solely on the Crownlands or the Iron Islands. Gendry proved adept at forging alliances with lesser lords who admired his rise from commoner to lord. He used his position to promote policies favoring skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, and other trades, perhaps a reflection of his humble origins. Many in the assembly came to respect him, though some old-blood nobles privately sneered at the idea of taking orders from a bastard-turned-lord. Through it all, Jon remained the steady fulcrum, the protector of the realm who sought no glory, only balance. Public trust in him ran high, a fact that ironically made some delegates uneasy, fearing he might betray them and seize permanent power. Jon could only laugh at the irony. If he had wanted a crown, he would have taken it long ago. But the suspicion was understandable in a realm with so many betrayals in living memory. As the final year of Jon's 7-year term approached, the matter of succession came to the forefront. The new constitution mandated an election for the next protector, open to any delegate who could secure the nomination of at least 2 regions. Jon had to decide whether he would stand for re-election or step aside to let another candidate ascend. Tyrion, Sam, and Davos urged him to continue, arguing that his leadership stabilized the realm and that he still had tasks left unfinished. Others, including Yara Greyjoy, were more ambivalent, suggesting that while Jon had done well, the system was meant to rotate power. Jon weighed the decision heavily. He had always seen himself as a steward of the realm's peace, not a permanent fixture. He worried that if he stayed too long, the people might come to see him as irreplaceable, defeating the purpose of the new democracy. Yet he also feared that handing the reins to a more ambitious or divisive figure could unravel years of hard work. Amid his deliberations, a messenger arrived from the north, bringing troubling news: an incursion of wildling raiders. Some breakaway group not aligned with Tormund's peaceful freefolk had ventured south of the Wall, attacking a northern village near the Long Lake. Several farmers were slain, and the villagers demanded swift justice. Sansa, who maintained communication with the freefolk, insisted these raiders were rogue elements acting on their own. Yet the fear in the north was palpable. Some northern lords cried for a punitive expedition into the Gift, worried that the free folk might unite against them again. Jon knew the complexities well. When he'd been Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, he'd tried to broker peace with the free folk. Most had settled peacefully in the north after the battle against the White Walkers, but not all tribes had integrated successfully. This was the first major incident in years. If handled poorly, it could reignite old hatreds. Jon decided to travel north to mediate, accompanied by a small retinue including Davos and a handful of assembly observers. Tyrion stayed behind to keep the government functioning. The journey felt both familiar and strangely new. They rode through the Riverlands, now green and dotted with signs of recovery. Freshly built farmhouses, fields of wheat, lively markets. Then they ascended into the north, where the air turned crisp and the nights longer. Jon felt a pang of nostalgia for Winterfell, recalling how he'd once walked these roads as a child, unaware of the destiny awaiting him. Ghost, bounding ahead, seemed rejuvenated by the cold, sniffing at drifts of snow with an eager wag of his tail. At Winterfell, Sansa greeted them in the Great Hall. She looked every inch the Lady of the North, composed, regal, wrapped in furs. They embraced briefly. Jon sensed her relief at his arrival, though she kept a measured expression in front of her bannermen. She led them to a private solar to discuss the crisis. Sansa explained that the Rogue Raiders, led by a wildling known as Grimmer the Wolfskull, had refused to stay within the agreed boundaries. They'd been exiled from Tormund's main settlement near the Gift, harboring old grudges against the northern houses. Grimmer believed the realm had grown weak, that the old ways of raiding were the only path to survival. Sansa, in turn, had posted extra guards at frontier villages, but she knew that if the North responded with brute force, many innocent free folk might be swept up in the violence, rekindling a war neither side wanted. Jon listened intently. He suggested summoning Tormund to help find a diplomatic solution. Sansa agreed. A raven had already been sent to Tormund, urging him to intervene. If they could corner Grimmer's group before they caused more harm, perhaps they could end the threat peacefully. But the northern lords, furious and fearful, demanded blood for the villages lost. They held a council in Winterfell's Great Hall, with Jon sitting beside Sansa on the dais. Lords Serwyn, Manderly, Glover, and others argued that the wildlings had broken the peace. They insisted the only answer was steel. Davos, stepping in with typical calm, recalled how the free folk had fought alongside them against the dead, how they were now nominally part of the realm. A realm deals with lawbreakers, but it doesn't make war on whole populations for the crimes of a few, he said. That's the difference between a realm of laws and one of vengeance. Some of the lords grumbled, but Sansa made it clear that the final decision rested with her as Lady of the North, and, implicitly, that Jon's authority as protector extended here in matters of realm-wide peace. They sent out scouting parties to track Grimmer's band, hoping to contain the threat without igniting a larger conflict. Jon rode with one such party, determined to see the situation firsthand. For a week, they traversed snowy hills and frozen forests. Ghost ranged ahead, occasionally returning with faint scents that suggested the wildlings had passed through. The small party of northern guards, led by a seasoned ranger, eventually found signs of a camp near a frozen stream. At dawn, they approached cautiously, seeing the silhouettes of crude tents among trees. Jon dismounted, urging the others to remain calm. He walked forward, hands raised to show he carried no weapon but Longclaw at his side. A handful of wildlings, ragged and underfed, stumbled out of the tents, startled. One brandished an axe. "Stay back, kneeler," he hissed. Jon recognized the fear in the man's eyes. He spoke in a steady voice. "I was of the Night's Watch once. I know what it's like beyond the wall. We have no wish to kill you." At that moment, a taller figure emerged. A man with a wolf's skull draped over his shoulders as a hood. His hair was tangled, and scars crisscrossed his face. Grimmer. He regarded Jon with open hostility. "You may have knelt to these southerners, but we haven't. The North pretends to let us live on their lands, but we scavenge while they fatten themselves in warm halls. No more." Jon looked around, noticing the gaunt faces of women and children among the wildlings. Some clutched crude spears. He could sense their desperation. "We can find you a place to live in peace," he said calmly. "This doesn't have to end in blood. The realm isn't what it once was. There's a new way of doing things. We can talk." Grimmer spat onto the snow. "Talk got us nothing but empty promises. We want what's ours. We take it." The tension snapped as a wildling to Grimmer's left hurled a spear. Jon dove aside, the spear lodging in the snow. The northern guards surged forward. A chaotic skirmish erupted. Ghost lunged at a wildling, forcing him to drop his weapon. Jon scrambled to his feet, drawing Longclaw, but shouting for the others not to kill unless necessary. The fighting was brief but vicious. In the end, a few wildlings lay wounded. A northern guard clutched a bleeding arm. Grimmer, cornered by 2 guards, tried to break free, but Jon tackled him to the ground. Sparks of rage lit Grimmer's eyes as he tried to wrench free, but Jon pressed him down. "Enough!" Jon roared, breath ragged in the icy air. "No one else has to die." The battered wildlings, outnumbered and exhausted, finally lowered their weapons. Jon's men bound Grimmer and the others who had fought. Some of the women and children sobbed, clutching the wounded. Jon ordered his guards to provide bandages, to keep everyone alive if possible. He felt a pang of sorrow, recalling how the free folk had once rallied under Tormund and Mance Rayder for freedom, not endless bloodshed. They returned to Winterfell with the captives, meeting Tormund on the road. The big wildling chieftain looked older too, streaks of gray in his red beard. When he saw Grimmer bound and seething, he shook his head. "You bloody fool," he muttered. "We had a chance to live in peace." Grimmer spat again. "We live under the foot of these kneelers, doing their bidding. That's not peace." Tormund sighed, addressing Jon. "Let me handle him. We'll see if we can't talk some sense into these hotheads, show them the new ways aren't so bad. But if they keep spilling innocent blood..." He let the implication hang. Jon nodded. "I'd rather let you handle your own people, but the North wants justice." Several northern villagers were slain. Tormund placed a heavy hand on Grimmer's shoulder. "Then we'll give them justice. I'll see he answers for what he's done. Some might say I should let him die, but I'll try to keep him breathing if it means we can avoid more fighting." Jon consulted with Sansa and the northern lords, securing an agreement that Tormund would punish the rogues according to free folk custom, exile or harsh labor, perhaps, in line with the North's demands for justice. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Some lords grumbled that the rogues deserved a hanging, but Jon and Sansa saw the bigger picture. A show of mercy might prevent a full-scale resurgence of wildling hostility, and Tormund, eager to maintain peace, vowed to keep a tighter rein on the more restless free folk. With the crisis contained, Jon lingered in Winterfell a while longer. He savored the crisp morning air in the courtyard, recalling how he'd trained there with Robb, how he'd once dreamt of being a ranger in the Night's Watch. The old Godswood, with its ancient heart tree, stood quiet under the pale northern sun. He found solace there, kneeling at the base of the heart tree, Ghost by his side. Memories washed over him. Ned Stark's stern kindness, Arya's mischievous grin, the swirling confusion when he first learned about his Targaryen blood. He closed his eyes, feeling the trunk's texture. He murmured a prayer, maybe to the old gods, maybe to no one at all, asking for guidance in what lay ahead. When he emerged from the Godswood, he found Sansa waiting. She stood tall in her fur cloak, autumn leaves drifting around her. They walked together along the castle ramparts, speaking softly. She asked about the realm, the challenges of the Assembly. He asked about her life in the North, the alliances she'd forged, the improvements she'd overseen. They spoke of how things had changed, from the days of House Stark's near extinction to the rise of a fragile democracy in King's Landing. As they leaned on the stone crenellations, she studied him. "You look tired," she noted quietly. "I know you bear a great burden, but are you well?" Jon managed a small, reassuring smile. "As well as one can be. It's a lot. And soon I'll have to decide whether to stand for another term as protector or let someone else take the mantle." She gazed out over the snowy fields. "Does your duty chain you to King's Landing? Or will you have the freedom to return here someday? I ask because we miss you, Jon. The North misses you. It would be good to have you back, if that's what you want." His heart ached at her words. "I miss it too, but the realm still needs stability. If I walk away too soon, there might be chaos. If I stay too long, I undermine the very notion of rotating leadership." She nodded, a pensive look on her face. "Sometimes I think it's all a grand experiment, a fragile one, but it's the best chance we have to avoid another wave of destruction. You're the one who made it real, Jon." He glanced at her, seeing the wisdom and sorrow in her eyes. Sansa had suffered so much, yet endured, shaping the North into a domain that reflected her resilience. He realized that, in her own way, she too was forging a new path, less dramatic than the assembly but vital nonetheless. Maybe that was the future. Each region, each leader, carving out a more humane way of life. He left Winterfell a few days later, promising to return for visits if time allowed. The road south felt both familiar and alien, as if he were perpetually caught between two identities. When he rode through the Neck, he thought of how many times armies had marched over this ground in the wars for the Iron Throne. Now, those wars were just stories, a cautionary tale of what happened when all power rested in one seat. Back in King's Landing, he discovered a swirl of political maneuvering around the upcoming Protector election. Various factions in the Assembly were rallying behind potential candidates, some championing Gendry Baratheon, others whispering about Lord Royce from the Vale, or even an up-and-coming merchant lord from the Reach. Tyrion, who was not officially a candidate but was still hugely influential, tried to stay neutral, though everyone knew his favor could tip the scales. Sam was also widely respected, but he had already declared he was uninterested in being Protector, preferring to remain Master of Laws and a scholar. Much to Jon's surprise, there was a strong push from multiple factions urging him to serve a second term. Their reasoning varied. Some genuinely believed he was the best man for the job, while others feared that a more partisan candidate might sow division. Jon met privately with Tyrion and Davos to discuss the matter. Davos, ever the voice of loyalty, insisted that Jon's presence gave the realm confidence. Tyrion pointed out that democracy was about choice. If Jon felt he could do another 7 years without betraying his own principles, perhaps it was the realm's will that he do so. But Jon did not decide lightly. He spent many sleepless nights pacing the corridors, recalling how the monarchy had once seemed unassailable. This new system, where even the Protector could be replaced, was a tender shoot in the soil of Westeros's ancient traditions. If he stayed too long, would it become dependent on him rather than the process itself? Finally, 2 months before the election, Jon convened a public session in the same courtyard where the assembly had first formed. Hundreds gathered, from delegates to common folk curious to hear what he had to say. The wind carried the taste of salt from Blackwater Bay, and the midday sun brightened the worn stones underfoot. Jon stood on the simple wooden platform, facing the crowd. Tyrion, Sam, Davos, and Gendry watched from behind him, their expressions attentive. Jon cleared his throat, a hush falling over the assembly. I stand here as Protector of the Realm, a title granted to me not by birthright but by your collective will. For 7 years, we've tried to guide Westeros away from the cycle of war, to a system where decisions are made by many rather than one. We have not been perfect, but we have walked a path of compromise and peace. He paused, scanning the faces before him. Soon, a new Protector shall be chosen. Many have asked me to stand for a second term. I am honored by the trust you place in me. Yet I must weigh that honor against the importance of this new system, this democracy, if you will. Part of what we've built is the idea that no one person should hold power indefinitely. We must show that our realm can prosper under changing leadership. A rumble of murmurs arose. Jon lifted his hand for silence. I have decided I will not stand for another full term. My duty was to help establish this new way of governing, and I believe that work is well on its way. If you wish me to serve until my term is complete, I will do so gladly. But after that, let another step forward, chosen by the Assembly's vote. He let out a slow breath. I do this not because I think myself unfit, or because I wish to abandon the realm. I do it because I believe in this system, and I believe Westeros must learn to thrive without relying on one man. When my term ends, I will support whoever is chosen as Protector, and I will remain available to serve the realm in other ways if needed. For a moment, the courtyard was silent except for the distant gulls and the flutter of banners in the breeze. Then a wave of conversation, exclamations, applause, and disbelief washed over the crowd. Some delegates were clearly disappointed, having counted on Jon's continued leadership. Others seemed excited by the prospect of genuine competition for the realm's highest office. The small folk in attendance appeared torn. Many admired Jon deeply, but they also saw the symbolism in his refusal to cling to power. Tyrion stepped up beside him, addressing the crowd in his characteristic measured tone. "You have heard the Protector's decision. This is the realm we've created, a realm where leaders serve terms, not lifetimes. Let us ensure this transition is peaceful and democratic. The Assembly will hold its election as scheduled, and Jon Snow will complete his term. We owe him our gratitude for guiding us through these first 7 years of an uncertain experiment." Amid the renewed buzz of voices, Jon caught Sam's eye. The big-hearted maester in training gave him a subtle nod of approval. Davos simply bowed his head slightly, acknowledging Jon's choice. Gendry looked thoughtful, perhaps weighing his own chances in the upcoming election. Yara Greyjoy, standing at the back, offered a wry grin, as though impressed by Jon's willingness to relinquish power. In the days following his announcement, the realm buzzed with speculation about who would run for Protector and what direction the next administration might take. Some worried that the departure of Jon would embolden ambitious lords to roll back the freedoms gained. Others argued that this was precisely the test the system needed, a change of leadership to prove that the realm could endure. Jon tried to focus on finishing his term well, ensuring a smooth handover. He met with committees, hammered out final agreements, and spent more time in the throne room, still missing a throne, listening to petitions from commoners and lords alike. If anything, the knowledge that his time in office was finite seemed to sharpen his resolve to leave the realm on solid ground. As election season officially began, the Assembly established rules for nominations. A candidate needed the endorsement of at least 2 regional delegations to appear on the ballot. This led to a flurry of negotiations, alliances, and behind-the-scenes deals. Some lords were furious at the notion of campaigning, calling it unseemly, but others embraced it, traveling throughout Westeros to make their case. The common folk watched with fascination, occasionally with dismay at the maneuvering, but they too realized this was history in the making, the first peaceful, contested election for the realm's highest seat. Gendry Baratheon emerged as a strong contender, championing infrastructure growth and support for craftsmen, his base of support coming from the Crownlands and many middle-tier houses in the Stormlands. Lord Royce of the Vale threw his hat in the ring, touting his long experience and the Vale's stable growth. A charismatic merchant lord from the Reach named Hally's Flowers, herself born a bastard, legitimized by a minor lord, and later rising to own a fleet of trading ships, also garnered attention as a symbol of upward mobility. Others mulled running but fell short of the required endorsements. Tyrion, frequently asked if he would run, demurred. "I'm more useful pulling the strings from the side," he joked, though some suspected he meant it. Sam made it clear he preferred scholarly pursuits. Davos had no interest in it, content with his role shaping naval policies and focusing on stability. Rumors spread that Sansa Stark or Yara Greyjoy might angle for the position, but neither sought endorsements in the end. The North, fiercely protective of its independence, was unlikely to support a northern candidate for Protector, as that would imply deeper entanglement. Jon watched this jockeying with a mixture of pride and trepidation. It wasn't always pretty. Accusations flew of bribes and slander, delegates formed shifting coalitions, and the specter of old rivalries hovered. But the key was that no one drew swords. No armies marched. This was politics, not war. Jon believed that, messy though it was, it might just be the path to lasting peace. As the election day drew near, delegates from each region prepared to cast their votes in a formal assembly. The city braced for crowds of spectators and well-wishers. Merchants saw an opportunity to profit from the influx. Inns were filled to bursting with lords and traveling entourages. Street vendors sold pastries shaped like crowns crossed out with an X, symbolizing the end of the monarchy. Others sold wooden wolf heads in honor of Jon's legacy, or tiny toy hammers referencing Tyrion's role as speaker. The atmosphere felt almost festive, though tension simmered underneath. At dawn on the appointed day, the delegates gathered in the courtyard once used for these historic gatherings. The melted iron throne sat off to the side as always, a silent symbol of the old ways. Rows of benches faced a raised platform where a trio of scribes and Sam, as master of laws, prepared to oversee the voting. Tyrion would moderate, ensuring procedure was followed. Jon, not a candidate, would watch from a seat of honor at the platform's edge, ghost by his feet. One by one, representatives from each region stepped forward to place a carved token with their chosen candidate's name into a large, ornate box. The Stormlands delegates, as expected, mostly favored Gendry. The Vale split, some supporting their own Lord Royce, others swayed by Hally's Flowers' promises of expanded trade routes. The Westerlands delegates were divided too. Some were still suspicious of Gendry's Baratheon name. Others admired his approach to economic policy. The Reach was a battleground, with Hally's Flowers leading strongly there, but pockets of old lords siding with Gendry or Royce. Dorne's delegates, always proud and aloof, gave a cryptic hint that they might distribute votes among multiple candidates. The Iron Islands had few votes but could tip the balance if the race was close, and Yara had been tight-lipped about her preference. The North allowed partial participation for realm-wide issues, cast a modest set of votes, though they were rumored to favor Gendry for reasons of old alliances going back to the Baratheon-Stark connection. The process took all morning. After the final delegate cast a token, the scribes carried the sealed box to a table where they counted each token under careful scrutiny. The crowd waited in hushed anticipation. Jon stood with arms folded, trying to read the expressions of Gendry, Royce, and Hally's, each of whom waited with their supporters. If any single candidate failed to achieve a majority, they'd hold runoff votes. At last, Sam approached Tyrion with a slip of parchment containing the tally. Tyrion cleared his throat, raising his voice to be heard over the tense silence. The results of the first ballot are as follows. Gendry Baratheon, 39 votes. Lord Royce, 27 votes. Hally's Flowers, 25 votes. 2 votes scattered for other minor nominees. Thus, no candidate holds a majority. A ripple of reaction swept the courtyard. Gendry looked relieved but also tense, knowing he was ahead but not yet victorious. Royce frowned. Hally's set her jaw with determination. They would need a second ballot, presumably with the lesser nominees dropping out. Delegates loyal to those minor candidates would realign, and the top 3 would vie for a majority. Jon sensed alliances would shift behind the scenes in the next few minutes, delegates bargaining and negotiating fervently. The courtyard became a flurry of hushed conversations as each candidate's supporters tried to win the scattered votes. Before the second round, Tyrion stepped forward. "We will allow a short recess for delegates to confer," he said, "but keep it brief. If we cannot settle on a majority, we proceed to runoff until one candidate remains." People broke into clusters, speaking in urgent whispers. Royce's camp tried to woo Hally's Flowers' supporters, or at least enough of them to push Royce over Gendry in the next round. Hally's group argued that Royce's time had passed, that she was the future. Gendry mostly stood quietly, his supporters praising his experience in forging the realm's roads and supporting commoners. Yara Greyjoy conferred with her small block of Ironborn delegates, turning occasionally to glance at Hally's Flowers. Something about Hally's background as a once bastard might resonate with the Ironborn's love of self-made strength. Or perhaps Yara would side with Gendry out of shared martial respect. It was impossible to guess. Jon watched from his vantage point, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't fully name. This was the moment that would define the realm's next 7 years. Any of the 3 could lead Westeros effectively, though each would bring a distinct style and set of priorities. There was no guarantee the next protector would be as moderate as Jon. After 10 minutes, Tyrion called them to order for the second ballot. Again, delegates filed up, some looking grim, others resigned, a few excited by last-minute deals. The tokens were cast, the box sealed, and carried to the counting table. Sam and the scribes worked quickly but meticulously, verifying each token. The courtyard's tension mounted. Finally, Sam passed the final tally to Tyrion. The imp's eyes flicked over the parchment, and he nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He lifted his voice again. The results of the second ballot are: Gendry Baratheon, 44 votes. Hally's Flowers, 34 votes. Lord Royce, 15 votes. 2 votes were discarded for irregularities. Therefore, Lord Royce is eliminated. We move to the runoff between Gendry Baratheon and Hally's Flowers. A stir of excitement swept the delegates. Royce looked crestfallen, though he maintained a stoic expression, shaking hands with some of his supporters. Gendry's supporters hooped and clapped, but Gendry himself seemed stoic, glancing at Hally's. She set her shoulders, resolved to fight to the last ballot. Now the question was how Royce's 15 supporters would realign. A final recess was called, during which Royce's delegates huddled. Would they throw their support to Gendry or Hally's? Royce himself, once a soldier, might prefer Gendry's martial background. Yet Hally's had made overtures to the Vale about shipping expansions, which could benefit the mountainous region. Tension crackled in the air. Jon caught Tyrion's gaze. Tyrion offered a small shrug, as though to say, "Let the process unfold. This is what we wanted." Jon's heart pounded faster. The throne had been replaced by a box full of wooden tokens, but the stakes felt no less monumental. When Tyrion called for the final vote, each delegate came forward a last time, placing a token inscribed with either Baratheon or Flowers into the box. Lord Royce himself approached with a deliberate step, token in hand. He paused just long enough to meet Gendry's gaze, then Hally's, before dropping his vote in without a word. The tension was palpable. The scribes carried the box to the table, and Sam oversaw the final count. Beads of sweat dotted his brow, reflecting the magnitude of this moment. The entire courtyard fell silent. Jon's grip tightened on Ghost's fur. This was it, a new chapter or a new volume in the realm story. At last, Sam stepped back, parchment trembling in his hands. He whispered to Tyrion, who nodded gravely, then faced the assembly. By the count of the final ballot, Tyrion declared, "We have a winner. Gendry Baratheon has received 53 votes. Hally's Flowers has received 42 votes. A wave of applause and cheers erupted, mingled with groans of disappointment from Hally's camp. Gendry's eyes widened in realization, a swirl of relief and responsibility crossing his face. Hally's, though clearly disheartened, extended a hand to Gendry, a polite gesture of concession. That small gesture prompted respectful applause from many onlookers. Tyrion's voice boomed over the din. "Then it is my honor, as Speaker of the Assembly, to announce that Gendry Baratheon is duly elected protector of the realm for the next 7 years. May he govern with wisdom and justice." Delegates filed forward to congratulate Gendry. He shook hands, receiving both genuine well-wishes and polite formalities. Hally's Flowers nodded graciously, telling him she'd continue to push for trade reforms from her seat in the assembly. Royce made a curt bow, promising to support the new protector as best he could. Gendry finally approached Jon, who stood quietly by the dais. I didn't believe I'd get this far," Gendry admitted, voice low so only Jon could hear. "You're an impossible act to follow." Jon gripped his forearm in a soldier's greeting. "It's not about following me. It's about serving the realm. Remember why you ran. Remember who you are. You've seen the realm from the bottom up. That perspective will help you lead." Gendry nodded, swallowing hard. "I won't forget." He glanced at the melted iron throne, that twisted relic of dragon fire. 7 years ago, we ended the monarchy. Now I step into this role with an election. It's surreal, but thank you for making it possible." Jon managed a faint smile. "I only did my part. This realm belongs to all of us now." Tyrion stepped over, an ornate chain of office in his hands, slightly different from Jon's, though similarly modest in design. The crowd hushed as Tyrion draped it over Gendry's shoulders. Applause broke out again, and Gendry, cheeks flushed, turned to wave at the assembly. Jon stood aside, quietly watching. There was no animosity, no sense of dethronement. This was the peaceful transition they'd all dreamed of. A formal swearing-in ceremony followed, brief by design. Gendry placed a hand on a simple text of the realm's new laws, pledging to uphold them and protect the people. The scribes recorded every word, ensuring an official record. Then, with the ceremony concluded, the city erupted in celebration. Musicians played in the streets, taverns offered discounts, and commoners thronged outside the Red Keep, eager for a glimpse of the newly elected protector. Some also cheered for Jon, chanting "White Wolf" as he passed, grateful for his role in sparing Westeros another war. As the day wore on, Gendry held an impromptu audience in the assembly hall, fielding well wishes and urgent petitions. Jon, meanwhile, found a moment of quiet, stepping away from the crowds to wander the corridors of the Red Keep. He came upon the courtyard where he had once addressed the realm alongside Sam and Tyrion, announcing the plan to dissolve the monarchy. The memory felt distant now, like recalling a dream. Had they truly come this far? He knelt to run a hand through Ghost's fur. The dire wolf looked up at him, head cocked as if to ask, "What next?" Jon let out a long breath. He would serve until Gendry was fully settled, helping him transition, but after that, perhaps he'd return to the north or find some quieter corner of Westeros. He had no illusions that he could fully escape the realm's needs. Tyrion might call on him for diplomatic missions or counsel, but at least he could step back from the daily grind of governance. 7 years of carrying the realm's burdens weighed heavily on him. In the evening, there was a modest feast in the Great Hall. Nothing like the lavish banquets of old, but enough to mark the occasion. Gendry sat at the center, receiving toasts. Hallie's Flowers was given a seat of honor as well, in recognition of her strong showing. Jon ended up at Tyrion's side, picking at a roast venison while Tyrion quipped about how far they'd come from the days of Joffrey's monstrous weddings. Near the end of the feast, Gendry rose to offer a short speech. He thanked those who had supported him, promised to build on Jon's legacy of cooperation, and pledged to listen to all corners of the realm. Finally, he lifted a cup toward Jon. To Protector Jon Snow, who refused to be king but became a leader all the same. May his example guide me and all who come after. A standing ovation followed, some stomping feet, Aras banging fists on tables in a sign of respect. Jon felt his cheeks grow warm. He raised his own cup in silent acknowledgement. This was closure, or as close to it as one could get in the ever-shifting tides of Westerosi politics. The next morning, Jon, Sam, and Davos walked the ramparts overlooking Blackwater Bay. Below them, ships moved in and out, carrying goods, travelers, and delegates departing after the election. The gulls cried overhead, and a brisk breeze tugged at their cloaks. Ghost stood near the parapet, peering curiously at the activity below. Davos spoke first. "I never thought I'd see the day a Baratheon ascended without a war or a rebellion. Times change." Sam nodded. "Times do change. It's proof our system might endure." Jon leaned his forearms on the stone. "It will endure if good people keep it alive. Our work isn't done, just different." Sam placed a comforting hand on Jon's shoulder. "You've earned a rest, though. Promise me you'll at least go somewhere quiet for a while. Winterfell, the countryside, anywhere." A ghost of a smile touched Jon's lips. "I might do that, but first, I'll make sure Gendry's transition is smooth. Then, yes, maybe it's time I return to the north, even if only for a visit." Davos scratched his beard. "Aye, you deserve that, but don't vanish completely, lad. We'll need you from time to time." They stood in companionable silence, watching as a merchant ship from Braavos hoisted its sails, heading out to sea. Jon recalled the old lines of House Stark. Winter is coming. Yet, for the first time in centuries, that warning might no longer signify doom alone. Winter would come, and after it, spring, and then another cycle. The realm would face new challenges, new threats, but it would do so with a structure that spread power among many hands. There would be squabbles, corruption, and the ever-present risk of backsliding, but at least the seeds of a more hopeful future were planted deep in Westeros' soil. In the weeks that followed, Jon guided Gendry through the responsibilities of Protector, sharing notes on existing policies, unresolved issues, key relationships, and the intricacies of foreign trade agreements. Gendry listened earnestly, occasionally scribbling notes or asking pointed questions. Once or twice, he admitted to Jon, "I'm not sure I'm ready." Each time, Jon reassured him that no one is ever fully ready, but the realm had chosen him because they believed in his capacity to grow into the role. Tyrion, still Speaker of the Assembly, took on the day-to-day legislative wrangling, occasionally pulling Gendry aside to educate him on parliamentary procedure. Sam continued to refine the code of laws, determined to close loopholes exploited by unscrupulous lords. Davos tended to the navy, ensuring that the Ironborn escorts stayed honest under the new administration. Hallie's Flowers, though she lost the election, remained vocal in the assembly, championing the expansion of local representation and trade opportunities for poorer regions. Royce returned to the Vale somewhat chastened, but still committed to the system that had rejected his candidacy. Jon's final day in the Red Keep arrived unheralded. He packed a few belongings, left most of his formal wear behind, and saddled a sturdy horse. Ghost prowled nearby, tail swishing with anticipation. He sought out Gendry for a last farewell, finding the new protector in the midst of a meeting with a delegation from the Reach. Gendry spotted Jon, excused himself politely, and stepped aside. "You're leaving already?" Gendry asked, brow creasing with concern. Jon nodded. "I've done what I needed to do. You don't need me looking over your shoulder. This is your realm now, yours and the Assembly's." Gendry swallowed. "I hope I don't let you down." "You won't." Jon clasped Gendry's hand. "You have good people around you. Trust them and trust yourself." With that, he turned and headed for the courtyard, leading his horse by the reins. Tyrion was waiting near the gate, holding a small skin of wine. He offered it to Jon. "A parting gift. If you tire of Northern chill, come back and see how Gendry's messing up. Governing the realm." Jon gave him a faint smirk. "I'll keep that in mind. Thanks for everything, Tyrion. You've been the architect of all this." Tyrion's mouth twitched with wry amusement. "Architect, maybe, but you were the cornerstone." They shared a brief embrace, then Jon swung into the saddle. Ghost padded alongside as he trotted out of the Red Keep and through the streets of King's Landing. Some passersby recognized him, offering cheers or waves, but he did not linger. He headed north, following the same roads he once traveled with purpose and dread. Now, he traveled with a sense of quiet fulfillment and a question. What next? In the weeks of travel that followed, he passed through villages that had once been ravaged by war. He saw new communities sprouting, local councils meeting in small halls, fresh farmland tilled under new agreements. He encountered people who asked if the rumors were true, that they now chose their representatives, that a blacksmith's daughter might one day rise to the assembly. Jon confirmed it was true, albeit not perfect or universal yet. But it was a start. By the time he reached the neck, the air had grown colder. He welcomed it, feeling the old northern spirit stir in his bones. He thought of Sansa, of the roads she was improving between Winterfell and White Harbor. He pictured Arya somewhere beyond the sea, exploring unknown lands. He reminisced about old times with Robb, with Ned, with the ghosts of those who had shaped him. The world had changed since those days. Dragons had come and gone, kings had risen and fallen, thrones had melted, and a new order had taken root. As he crossed into the north, the wind carried the scent of pine and snow. Ghost's ears perked up, as though recognizing home. Jon stared at the distant silhouette of Winterfell's towers. He felt a pang of emotion, remembering the boy he'd been, standing in the courtyard, dreaming of glory or acceptance. He was no longer that boy, and Westeros was no longer a kingdom bound under one throne. Yet it was, in a strange way, more united than ever, united by the fragile tapestry of representation and shared responsibility. He pressed onward, the chill intensifying with each league. The horse's breath plumed in the cold air, and Jon pulled his cloak tighter. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the next chapter of his life, unbound from the chains of power, yet still tied to the realm he had helped remake. He might never stop feeling the weight of what he had done. Killing Daenerys, dissolving the monarchy, presiding over the realm as protector. But he could rest now, knowing the realm was in someone else's hands, shaped not by a single will but by many. Twilight deepened, painting the northern sky in shades of purple and gray. Jon halted atop a ridge to watch the sunset. Ghost stood beside him, silent and watchful. The hush of the northern wilderness soothed the echoes of the city and the assembly halls. He thought again of that melted throne, how it had once symbolized absolute rule. Now it was merely a relic in a courtyard, overshadowed by the hum of debate, ballots, and common voices raised in decision. Daenerys had wanted to break the wheel, and though her path had turned tragic, the wheel was broken, or at least damaged beyond repair. Jon spurred his horse forward. Tomorrow he would arrive at Winterfell, see Sansa, perhaps find some tasks to occupy him in the library or the training yard. Perhaps he'd journey beyond the wall again someday, just to remember the wide, unspoiled wilderness. The details didn't matter much. What mattered was that Westeros was moving on a path of compromise and collective rule. It wouldn't be easy, might never be, but it was real. It was happening. And in the quiet swirl of snow, with dusk gathering, Jon Snow urged his horse into a steady canter, the wind in his hair, the direwolf at his side. The north beckoned him home, and behind him, a realm struggled, succeeded, stumbled, and grew, alive with possibility, forging a future free from the iron weight of a single throne.